Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The American South, a very short introduction, by Charles Reagan Wilson. Narrated by Jim Seybert. Introduction. The American South has a dramatic history that has made it a distinctive place on the world stage, one with continuing significance into the 21st century. Its early history illuminates the expansion of Europe into the New World, creating a colonial, plantation slave society that made it different from other parts of the United States, but fostered commonalities with other southern places that had similar colonial experiences. The Civil War and Civil Rights Movement are historical events that transformed the South in differing ways and remain part of a vibrant public memory, one that the region's peoples and outsiders to the region often contest. In the 20th century, the South's pronounced traditionalism in customs and values was in tension with the forces of modernization that only slowly forced change. The American South has long evoked powerful imaginative responses to these experiences, making it well known around the world through films, literature, and music. Writers probe the psychology of its people, and scholars analyze its culture. Travelers sketch their observations on the customs of the people they meet, and Southerners themselves brood over their inheritance and their destiny. Country ballads and blues music lay bare the South's complexities and tragedies, but celebrate the joy of life in the region as well. The cultures that took root in the South grew out of physiographic locales and ecologies, and the differing ethnic backgrounds of people who shaped the land and its human societies. Two broad geographical subdivisions anchor what became known as the South: an uplands, stretching from the Appalachian Mountains in the eastern South through the hill country of Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, and into central Texas, and a lowlands, from the Atlantic coast through the Gulf South, the piney woods, and the deep south of the Black Belt and the Mississippi Delta. Several themes shape this narrative introduction to the South. One is an inevitable concern with what has made the region different from other American places. Pervasive Southern storytelling and American stereotyping have highlighted the South's places and peoples as different from those elsewhere in the nation. Despite dramatic convergences of the South with the rest of the nation, public opinion polling and other evidence suggests Southerners and non-Southerners still identify such traits as not only manners and hospitality, but also violence and prejudice with the South. A second theme is the one scholars increasingly stress: that the South exemplifies, sometimes in the extreme, American experiences. A third theme now places the South into an even broader context than the North-South one, namely a global perspective that shows long-standing Southern connections with the Atlantic world, especially the Caribbean islands. Much of the South's history was that of a colonial society, and its people still struggle with its aftermath as a post-colonial society. A fourth theme is the centrality of cultures in understanding the ideological, material, and spiritual experiences of people in the region. Promoters of Southern unity have always stressed the singularity of its culture, but in fact many cultures have grown out of the productive Southern soil. Finally, Southern life has always had a multicultural nature. Although racial concerns have been at the center of American life in general, no other place has engaged people of such differing backgrounds as Western Europeans and West Africans over such a long period of time. The region's whites tried to segregate the races, but they could not segregate the eardrum, the eye, or the palate, so that the vibrant music, art, and food that have come out of the South show a cultural interaction, despite formal separation of racial groups. The South has now become the new center of immigration, adding to the complexity of the region's life as it emerges into a new 21st century demographic complexity. Recent scholarship has expanded the time frames of Southern history, going back in time beyond the early 19th century sectional conflict that promoted a more pronounced regional consciousness. The indigenous tribes of the Southeast were the first creators of Southern places, and their legacy long outlived their exile to the Southwest. The colonial-era South now appears as the most heterogeneous part of North America, given the variety of European and African peoples who came there. Historians are breaking down the borders of the South to focus on regions within the larger South and to explore border areas, as well as core zones of Southern cultural life. The region's dominant public culture, expressed in officially sanctioned rituals and narratives that established authorized versions of the past while ignoring the experiences of minority groups, was part of the exercise of power by some Southerners over others. Folk ways that grew out of the interaction of Native Americans and peoples from Western Europe and West Africa within the context of a predominantly agricultural economy and rural life, give glimpses of a grassroots South, sometimes in opposition to the public culture. Speaking of the South brings attention to the importance of regionalism in American history. The vast scale of American geography and adaptation of human cultures to their environments promoted the emergence and development of regional cultures. The larger areas, the South, the West, New England, and the Midwest, have massive scholarship documenting them, with those places each playing differing roles in the nation. Within the American South, a plethora of regions, the Mississippi Delta, South Louisiana, the Bluegrass, the Hill Country, the Piedmont, the Tidewater, the Appalachians, and the Ozarks, among others, bring the abstract descriptor of the South down to the ground of localism. The spatial turn in cultural studies is apparent in looking at the history of the American South. Commentators on the South sometimes Call Atlanta its capital, and anyone from the region flying elsewhere through the busy and crowded Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport would recognize its centrality to the region at least. You cannot get to heaven, the saying goes, without going through Atlanta. Transportation and communication have always defined the city, from its beginnings in the 1830s as a remote transportation outpost called Terminus, to the role of super television station WTBS in the 1970s, to housing the busiest airport in the world. Known as the gateway city of the South in the 19th century, and the city too busy to hate in the 1950s and 1960s, Atlanta now promotes itself as the world's next great city. The Georgia capital hosted the 1996 Olympics, arguably the moment when Atlanta and the South took a giant leap onto the contemporary world stage. To be sure, global movie audiences had watched the burning of Atlanta during the Civil War in Gone with the Wind, 1939, the story of military defeat and occupation touching audiences in many places in the World War II era. And the world recognized that the civil rights movement was part of a worldwide freedom struggle by 20th century people of color. But the Olympics is one of the most prominent international events, and winning the right to host it was an undeniable boon to a perpetually boom-oriented city. In its proposal to the International Olympic Committee, the city highlighted the American South's racial progress since the Civil Rights Movement, with Mayor Andrew Young, one of the most prominent civil rights leaders, able to speak with authority to that point. Boosting the local economy through tourism and economic development was a major goal of Atlanta's Olympic leaders, who hoped to use the occasion to gather money for infrastructure improvements and the remaking of downtown Atlanta, which had suffered from the flight of middle and upper-class whites to the suburbs since the 1970s. The Olympic programs highlighted Southern cultural images, from soul singer Gladys Knight singing Georgia on My Mind, the state song, at the opening ceremonies, to a Welcome to the World feature that celebrated a college football Saturday in the South, with cheerleaders, Chevrolet pickup trucks, marching bands, and high-steppers from African-American football tradition. Another feature, Summertime, showcased Atlanta and Southern history, culture, music, spirit, and the city's rebuilding after the Civil War. The logistical challenges of the Atlanta Games proved embarrassing for a future-oriented city. And then a terrorist attack by a lone gunman brought anxiety to athletes and others attending. All this took some of the glow off the glittering hopes of the Olympics organizers to present the city and its region with undiluted glory. Atlanta could brag about the estimated $5.41 billion economic impact, 2 million visitors for the Games, and 3.5 billion viewers on televisions around the world. Modern infrastructure improvements included dormitories built for the Games converted to Georgia Tech University housing, construction of multiple athletic facilities, improvements to 2 housing projects, upgrades to the sewer system, repair of dilapidated bridges, and the lasting memorial of the Games, Centennial Stadium, which became the home of the city's Major League Baseball team, the Braves. The Atlanta Games refurbished the South's claim to a special Southern hospitality through relentless mentioning of it. But the complex issues of Southern race relations were hard for visitors to miss. That mid-1990s moment saw escalating controversies about public display of the Confederate flag, especially the appearance of the flag's defining image, St. Andrew's Cross, on the Georgia state flag. African Americans saw the image as a throwback to slavery and racial segregation, while some whites believed it represented the heritage of a region that had experienced and should not forget the historical traumas of Civil War defeat. The well-promoted ideal of racial harmony, which had been a dream of Southern commercial advocates since the New South movement led by Atlanta newspaper editor Henry Grady in the 1880s, was contradicted by the controversial monument at Stone Mountain, only a short drive from Atlanta, with the images of 3 Confederate heroes carved into a giant stone outcropping. The Atlanta Olympics epitomizes such themes as race relations, economic development, and cultural expression that figure prominently in the larger story of the American South. It dramatized for international audiences that, despite all the changes in the region since the 1960s, its biggest city remained a vital place. The South matters as a meeting place of peoples from Europe and Africa who interacted with indigenous peoples to create a fractious but creative place. Along the way, a Southern identity evolved, but it has remained a recognizable one. The screenwriter and actor Eugene Walter, born in Mobile, Alabama, who collaborated on many films with Federico Fellini, wrote in 1971, "When I say I'm Southern, most people, even in Europe, know what is signified." They knew that he came from that country within a country, recognized as such although having no definable boundary. On his terrace above a busy street in Rome, he grew mint for his mint juleps and wormwood in case he wanted to make absinthe. Tokens of a regional identity he could embody from Mobile to Rome. Chapter 1. Becoming Southern. Native peoples became the first Southerners. Although they would not have used that descriptor, they developed the first regional culture from environmental conditions that would always be a foundation of regional life. A shared symbolism crossed a region from Texas to the Atlantic Ocean and from the Ohio River Valley into Florida, including origin stories that typically represented native peoples emerging out of a world covered with water, as with a crawfish in Louisiana, diving to the bottom and bringing up the mud that became dry land. Winged serpents and bird-like human warriors enlivened imaginations, while a mythic cross represented the earth and its cardinal directions. A robust trade in finished crafts took Etowah copper carvings throughout the region, and the Temple Mound at Cahokia in present-day Missouri displayed carved shells from the Atlantic and suggested a western limit to this first South. In the early 13th century, the culture of the Mississippian period declined, with the depletion of timber and game, chronic tribal warfare, and loss of population. Southeastern tribes adapted and reorganized. The arrival of Europeans beginning in the 15th century challenged Native Americans of the Southeast, and new diseases and warfare contributed to the area becoming a shatter zone that resulted in their decline. Native groups formed new tribes. By the mid-1700s, Indians were no longer effectively challenging white authority in Virginia and the Carolinas, but in the interior and border areas, the Indian population was twice as large as the combined white-black population. Still, an estimated population decline of as much as 70% between 1500 and 1600, and another third in the 18th century decimated native life. European settlement. The Europeans who came to the southeastern area of North America, what became the American South, brought with them preconceptions about that area, which was part of a new world that evoked images of a tropical climate, a fertile land that produced staple crops to enrich European nations, but also represented exploitation of African and indigenous labor and the threat of racial intermingling. If the Puritans established New England as a city on a hill, the white colonists in southern areas drew from earlier European imagery in portraying their region as a southern paradise. The English adventurer Sir Walter Raleigh had predicted that the Garden of Eden would be found in the New World on the 35th parallel of latitude, on a line now between Fayetteville, North Carolina, and Memphis, Tennessee. There was a recurring religious dimension to the images of southern colonies, which Europeans described as a land of Canaan and a promised land. One of the first texts to interpret the emergent South was Robert Beverley's The History and Present State of Virginia, 1705, which developed the image of the Virginia plantation as a paradise, an Arcadia as in classical times, with all the positive implications of that heritage. He confronted, as well, the special circumstances of slaves in the garden, foreshadowing the efforts of 19th-century Southern writers to see how a paradise could contain African slaves. Before the English came to Virginia, Spanish and French explorers were the leading edge of European incursions into Indian lands of the South. Lucas Vasquez de Illon insisted in 1521 that he had found a new land along the Gulf Coast, on the same latitude as the province of Andalusia in Spain. It was a place of abundance that could produce olive oil and wine, which was bound to get a Spaniard's attention. The Spanish went thus to Florida, and Hernando de Soto landed at Bradenton in 1539, exploring the South to the Mississippi River and leaving a bloody trail, enslaved indigenous people, and disease. De Soto's death and burial in the Mississippi River was a cautionary tale of early exploration in search of European dreams in the South. In the 1560s, the Spanish founded St. Augustine, the first European settlement in the southeastern part of North America. France undertook European development of the Mississippi River Valley through early explorations from the north and by founding the colony of Louisiana in 1699. Jamestown in Virginia was the first successful English colony, established in 1607, and other southern colonies followed. The climate in these places favored a long growing season and promoted an agricultural economy based on tobacco, rice, and indigo, and later cotton and sugar. Contemporary observers saw that architecture, clothing, and even the pace of life and speech were affected by a climate that supposedly produced a characteristic lethargy and gave birth to a tenacious stereotype of Southern laziness. Geography did not, however, unify the emergent South. Mountain ranges and rivers divide the South, and its plains and valleys run north and south, connecting with land in other regions. Mountains and hill country areas, for example, were favored by small-scale yeoman farmers, while the lowlands were home to wealthy plantation owners and enslaved peoples. The 18th century. The early 1700s were crucial years in the emergent South. The population grew, the colonial economy and society matured. Planter elites asserted colonial political power within the empire, and colonists relied increasingly on chattel slavery of Africans. The accumulation of land by the early 1700s enabled a few planters to gain cultural authority within an increasingly hierarchical world of gentlemen and their women, slaves, and yeoman farmers. The plantation mansion became perhaps the earliest symbol of an emerging Southern identity in the 18th century. Anglicanism, an American version of the English national religion, was the established church in the Southern colonies, and it provided a degree of unity through worship services, a common theology and moral values, and education. The English country gentleman ideal was transplanted to the southern colonies by the 1700s. Pastoral imagery of settled farms and livestock herding that harked back to Arcadian images of classical civilization became the model for the emergent southern elite. Out of a self-conscious cultural identity crisis of the early 1700s, as colonists began to grapple with their situation far from the home country of England, came new loyalties to colonial identities and a broader sense of regional community based in shared social arrangements. Virginian William Byrd II was a representative figure in the adaptation of the English gentry identity to an evolving Southern context. Born in England, he became a self-conscious Virginian and a model for later Southern planters. He saw financial matters as central concerns to New England merchants and slave traders, and believed his slave owner class was different from them in attention to an ethic of honor and religious values. He foresaw bad consequences from the growing numbers of African slaves in Virginia, who were increasing so rapidly that he feared the colony would soon go by the name of New Guinea. Byrd devoted most of his extensive writings, however, to separating himself from the plain white folk. His account of surveying the dividing line between North Carolina and Virginia identified the differences between his people and the frontier plain whites. Byrd sketched a lively, but troubling to him, image of Lubber Land, a frontier wasteland in Carolina. Wealthy planters had gradually gained control of the best Virginia lands in the 16th century, leaving poorer sorts frustrated. In Bacon's Rebellion, 1679, Nathaniel Bacon, a young English gentleman only recently arrived in the colony, organized frontier planters to oppose larger planter families who controlled the colonial government. The frontier planters favored a harsh Indian policy to secure their landholdings, but Governor William Berkeley used the militia to subdue the rebellion and augment the authority of the largest planter estates. White racial dominance emerged as soon as Europeans, Indians, and Africans met each other in the early days of Virginia. A Dutch ship brought 20 Africans to Jamestown in 1619, the very year that Virginia established the House of Burgesses to govern the colony, symbolizing the promise of political liberty. The slave population expanded throughout the southern colonies in the late 1600s and early 1700s, bringing wealth to white landowners, but stoking whites' fear of black people in their midst. The Stono Rebellion, 1739, in South Carolina, was a slave insurrection that led to the deaths of about 25 white people and 35 enslaved people. It brought more regulation of slave life and pressures to end the slave trade. The triangular trade between the Caribbean, New England, and the South brought wealth to the colonies, and European and African cultures were surely formative ones in the South. Southern planters raised staple crops to market in the emerging capitalist world system. The commodification of African bodies was a terrible symbol of the dark side of transatlantic connections, but black people became an active influence in a nascent creolized Southern society. Cultural foundations. The history of the South properly begins with Native Americans, whose use of natural resources and their location of settlements and transportation routes would be models for Europeans and Africans. Indian names still mark rivers and states, and their agricultural and dietary habits linger, as later Southerners eat grits and squash casseroles. Likewise, the folk medicine passed down across generations of Southerners is a mixture of Indian herbal knowledge and European and African elements. Many of the folk tales in Southern oral tradition are originally from Native American lore. European influence was apparent as well. The British social class structure, European musical and literary forms, Enlightenment rationalism, Christian theologies and institutions, and European farming techniques all became vital, evolving elements of early Southern culture as well. Africans contributed specific knowledge from their homelands, as their familiarity with herding livestock and cultivating rice and indigo enriched the early Carolina Lowcountry. Despite the rigid legal boundaries of an emerging caste system, cultural integration began through the transfer of knowledge, customs, and ways of separate peoples. The years between 1720 and 1780 were a cultural watershed for black Southerners because importation of slaves dramatically increased. Slaves from different African regions and tribal origins used pidgin languages to forge new identities in the South. Slaves remembered and passed along African ideas about family, the individual's place in the universe, musical forms, and skills such as metalworking and woodcarving, herding, boat-making and navigation, and rice cultivation. Slaves devised long-lasting traditions of rhythmic music and dance, and of communal child-raising. The slave quarters were a hearthstone for an African-American version of Southern culture. The frontier experience also shaped the emergence of a Southern identity. As settlers moved west, conflicts developed between the Tidewater gentry and the backcountry yeomen, often class conflicts that mirrored social divisions between eastern and western parts of the southern colonies. New ethnic populations put their mark on the frontier as well. Scots-Irish and German settlers came to North America in increasing numbers in the mid-1700s, and they migrated from western Pennsylvania into the Piedmont and soon crossed the Appalachian Mountains. The Scots-Irish represented an especially large ethnic culture introduced into Southern life in the colonial era, one that became associated with the frontier. If the Tidewater aristocracy was English in style and outlook, the Scots-Irish left their imprint to the West. Their ballad-singing musical forms became one basis for later country music singers. They planted Calvinist religious ideas that would feed into the South's predominant evangelical Protestant faith. They became self-sufficient farmers and practiced herding techniques, brought from their Northern Ireland homelands. Colonists from Germany, Switzerland, the
Sample complete. Ready to continue?